So good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the Center for the Study of Europe at Boston University, the Pardee School of Global Studies. Today, we are delighted to have a seminar that is very meaningful to us. It's part of a general series on structures of inequality in Europe, and we believe that the idea of minority discrimination very much pertains to this theme. We are also very happy to have special guests today. They will give their presentations, and after that, every attendee is invited to use the Q&A question. I will read the questions to the speakers in the order that they appear. So let me start with some introductions of our speakers today. So we start with Dr. Eddie Bruce Jones, who joins us today from the School of Law of Boston University nearby, where he now holds the prestigious title of Kleh Visiting Professor of Law. His primary base is in London, actually. He is Deputy Dean of the School of Law and Reader in Law and Anthropology at Birkbeck College in the University of London. Dr. Bruce Jones's research, writing, and activism focus on migration, racism, sexuality, colonialism, state violence, and citizenship. He is the author of Race in the Shadow of Law, State Violence in Contemporary Europe, published by Routledge in 2016, and also the co-author of a forthcoming casebook on race and law in Europe, and BC writing wonderful things. He gave us a little preview during his Kleh lecture at BU. In September, Dr. Bruce Jones delivered the inaugural lecture for us for the Center for the Study of Europe's newly launched Structures of Inequality series on the topic of race and law in Europe. We are delighted to have him back with us today for another look at how minority discrimination happens in Europe. Dr. Sultan Doughan holds a degree in anthropology from UC Berkeley. Her scholarship revolves around questions of citizenship, religious differences, racialization of Jewish and Muslim communities in Germany. She is particularly concerned with how genocide commemoration intersects with practices of secular liberal citizenship in Europe. Dr. Doughan has conducted field research in Berlin among civil society organizations that were funded to combat Islamic extremism by teaching tolerance through the memory of the Holocaust. Dr. Doughan is currently a post-doctoral fellow at the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies here at Boston University. During the fall semester of 2020, she is teaching a course on memorials and the question of transitional justice with a special focus on post-Holocaust Europe and post-slavery US. She is currently working on a book tentatively called Converting Citizens, German Secularism and the Politics of Tolerance After the Holocaust. And then we have with us Dr. Margareta Matache from Harvard University. Dr. Matache is a justice activist and scholar from Romania, director of the Roma Program at the FXB Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard University, and a Harvard instructor. From 2005 to 2012, Dr. Matache was the executive director of Romani CRIS, a leading Roma rights organization. In 2012, she was awarded a Hauser postdoctoral fellowship at the Center for Health and Human Rights at Harvard, where she founded the university's first and only Roma program. In 2017, with Jacqueline Baba and Andrei Mirga, she co-edited Realizing Roma Rights, an investigation of anti-Roma racism in Europe. Also, along with Jacqueline Baba and Caroline Elkins, Dr. Matache is the co-editor of Time for Reparations, a forthcoming volume exploring the issue of reparations across a broad range of contexts and disciplines. She received a master's degree in public administration from the JFK School of Government at Harvard and a doctoral degree in political sciences from the University of Bucharest. I am delighted to introduce them today to you all, and I look forward to their presentations, which will then be followed by a discussion session. Dr. Bruce Jones, take it away.
Thank you so much, Daniela, for this invitation to the panel. And I'm really happy to be in conversation with my colleagues, Sultan and Magda. And thank you also, Elizabeth. So I'm just going to give a few thoughts about experiences of, experiences of being Black in Europe, experiences that are informed by Black thinkers, activists, and organizers in Europe. And there's not a whole lot that I can do in 15 minutes to get across the diverse ways in which Blackness is experienced, and in which it also comes into connection with other forms of other communities, and also with other forms of racism across the European countries and the European space, and more conceptually in terms of the European project, what race means in Europe. Is a diverse array of things. So hopefully that will tease itself out as we go through the discussion. But for about 12 to 15 minutes, I'll just talk about a few things that I think come up as key points that I'd like to kind of bring into this discussion. The first is that race as a concept does a particular type of conceptual work that in the European space gets put to the side and kind of marginalized in a very particular way. So one common thing that I hear often, and maybe it's particularly also because I'm a scholar from the US, and even though I've lived in Europe for half of my life, because of the perspectives that I bring and my background and my accent, I'm very quickly reminded in European settings that race is not a concept that belongs in Europe. So this is what I'm told by some colleagues, even liberal-minded colleagues who want to address racial disparity and want to kind of address problems of racism. A lot of times tell me that race as a concept is either outdated or it's an American framing of issues. And while sometimes the way that we frame race and racism is a bit off. I mean, we can't just apply very particular concepts of race in every setting and expect it to do the work. But there's a way in which conceptually race does something that other terms don't do. So for example, xenophobia is not the same as race, although there are discursive overlaps in the way that race and being from outside of the country in terms of nation or citizenship or belonging are deployed. It's not the same as nationality. It's not the same as ethnicity. So all of these concepts do particular work, and there are overlaps and synergies, but they're not interchangeable. Language that's spoken at home, which is a lot of times a proxy for race, or at least difference that can be somehow associated with some sort of difference in background, is not conceptually doing all of the work that race and racialization and processes of othering are doing. So it's important to keep that in mind when thinking about what racial discrimination looks like and how to think theoretically about how these things affect people's lives in a whole range of ways. The other thing is a term that I've learned from some friends who are a bit younger, gaslighting. I think I'm late to understand what that term means. And it basically means when you're told that it's all in your head, that you're inventing problems, and that those problems don't really exist, or you're being oversensitive to certain problems and you're inventing new problems. And I think it's worth reflecting on this concept, not as a new concept, but quite an old concept, and definitely a concept that's used in Europe in a way to blend out the concerns of certain communities. So for example, the model of French republicanism that tells us that racial difference or difference in backgrounds is always subordinate to being French, and being French as a unifying feature of being French that encapsulates equality, liberty, and fraternity just by being French, and kind of makes other forms of difference less relevant in people's lives, doesn't really work if we want to understand how racism affects people's lives, because that also means that it's difficult to talk about, identify, and then categorize different forms of discrimination and violence. And that also puts the onus on the people who experience racism to develop a way to discuss it without using the concepts that might do the work to enable us to identify it, count it, measure it, discuss it, and then find a solution for it. So in France, you can't collect statistics on race because the category is banned. So that's kind of an entry point to this whole gaslighting phenomenon that is kind of a part of our social policy in different places in Europe. Similarly, the conversation about critical race theory being a banned concept, which we've heard in the United States, has also emerged in the UK. So the United Kingdom's Equalities Minister, who's a conservative member of Parliament, has recently decreed that the UK government, the conservative government, is unapologetically against critical race theory and Black Lives Matter because of the anti-capitalist, among other things, the anti-capitalist inclinations of Black Lives Matter, which conflates lots of things, but it also creates a term for wanting to, for nuanced understandings of race that link into education and the way that we conceive of race and racism. So it's really at the level of being able to scrutinize and recognize what's happening, while it's also about protests and it's also about presence in terms of Black Lives Matter. It's about the thoughts. And I think that's a very dangerous space to be in. Very quickly, the experience of racism is not always apprehended by law. And I'll talk more about that maybe in the discussion, but there are ways in which law is structured in not only in Europe, in lots of places, to focus on certain things to the exclusion of other things when thinking about people's experience. So in France, I mentioned one can't collect data on race to see patterns of racism. Similarly, in Germany, it's not criminally outlawed, but it's not government policy to collect data that's disaggregated by racial background. In lots of places like the UK, you can collect statistics on racial background that are disaggregated and kept separately from, let's say, employment applications to track discrimination potentially in the hiring pool. But we've just heard that the conservative government doesn't want us to talk about structural forms of racism or teach about these ways of looking at racism. So that really does affect the way that we can identify some of the more systemic ways in which people are discriminated against, and not just keep it at the level of individual bad apples that are doing bad things. And a note on that, the European Union has a new action plan to combat racism. Part of that is better data collection. So the European Union has, at least at a very high level, decided that data collection for these purposes is important, but it doesn't give states so far a mandate in terms of how to do that and whether it's enough for a country like France to say, well, we've outlawed the category. We no longer have a need to collect data on a category that's illegitimate. So the EU seems to be saying, no, we need to be able to identify and define things, but we'll see how that plays out in the European setting. And last, experiences of race and racism have to be understood historically. So the slide before was a slide of various people of African descent who've been killed by police in Germany. And this links with the data because there's not data disaggregated by race about people who are being killed or brutalized by police, but there are stories that are qualitative and being collected by organizers, community members, bereaved family members that are doing some of the work to at least scope out what the characteristics are of this type of brutality. And it's being linked to historical ideas about who belongs in Europe, why this is happening, what targeting looks like. In particular, in my work, I look at how Black people are targeted and otherized in the European space. And one intervention came from Sivanandan, who led the Institute of Race Relations. We are here because you were there. And that's a way to frame colonialism. And he was talking about the British context, but there are ways to think about that in other places in Europe. The global power dynamics of European countries with the rest of the world are not unconnected from global migration, from the ways in which Europe is seen as a white project, and therefore people who are not white are targeted, or how culture is inscribed onto certain people, and this goes across various communities. So it's kind of a symbolic idea And I'll just end with kind of a 1-minute reflection on public space. The public discourse on race and racism in the last few years in Europe has become more sharply rooted around nationalism and unabashedly racist. And while we see this pushback from certain governments saying, don't call us racist, we're not racist, this isn't racism, there's a language that kind of does the work that we don't need to express why it's racism, we hear and see it. So these are posters from the third largest political party in Germany. One says, new Germans, will make them ourselves. And it shows a pregnant white woman in a field. And that's, I mean, for me, there's no hiding the biological racism in that type of poster. And this is in the public, you know, these posters were on streets, on street signs when you walk down the street as political campaign posters. And another one, diversity, we've already got it. And pair that with the work that Black Germans have been doing to change street names and to investigate historical representations in our lived environment. So this is, I'll end with this, a street that was changed basically. It used to be called Grobenufer, so after Friedrich von Groben, who was one of the architects for a fort that was used during German colonial adventures in Africa. It was a fort in Ghana, and he was celebrated, and the street was named after him. And it was after a long debate, public debate, that Black German activists got the street renamed to Mayayim Ufa. And she was a poet and writer who examined what it's like to be Black and a woman in Germany, in contemporary Germany, and to tell German history through that lens. So with that, I'll leave it there and I'll pass it on to my colleagues. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Elie. Okay, great to begin on this note. Sultan, your perspective. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Daniela and Elizabeth, for organizing this conversation. Let me share my screen with you. And yeah, thanks, Elie, for this really rich input and the conceptual frame that you've provided. I think it's actually really good and rare that we have this conversation in this order, where we basically intersect Black lives, Muslim lives, and Roma and Sinti lives in their particularities, but also in their overlaps. So what I want to present to you today is basically this phenomenon that emerged over the last 20 years that is called the Muslim problem in Europe. And I will provide a perspective from Germany, where I did my field work. And just to give you a little background, what happened in Germany with regards to the Muslim problem, which is kind of considered a pan-European problem. And as I think Elie just showed so beautifully, it has been taken up very openly by nationalist parties, but actually it's kind of a racial relationship, if you like, that goes across the political spectrum. And that on the one hand touches Muslims as a religious group, but actually also grows out of an anxiety over migration and those who are considered not European enough or not of Europe. So I'm going to give you just a little background on the two major groups that I have worked with during fieldwork. They were of Turkish or Palestinian descent, and they came, or basically those who I worked with were actually German citizens, but their parents or their grandparents, in some rare cases, had either come as labor migrants or as refugees. But now they were all seen as part of a religious issue. But in fact, and this is, I think, what Elie was pointing to, is that, when we think of race or racism, oftentimes the kind of legal structure that has produced a certain group as a problem is not taken into account. So that also means, the ability to actually stay, the ability to organize, to do politics, to have access to certain institutions, including education, including good housing, including care. And this has to do also with Germany's history of like how Germany perceived itself for actually pretty much all of its modern history until 1998. Germany denied being a country of immigration. Only in 1998, actually, it changed citizenship laws, conditionally so, that meant that those who had been living in Germany since the 60s could now actually apply for citizenship if they were employed. And they could also make a case or a claim for their children if they were born on German soil. So Germany branded this as like kind of a birthright to citizenship, but in many ways it actually stayed conditional. And with that, in the early 2000s, so that shift was basically done in the early 2000s. With that shift, what happened is that this group that was earlier seen as foreigners, as Ausländer, as, you know, and there are also some derogatory terms like Schwarzköpfe, like black heads, Moorheads, were now coming into a different position. And the different position was that they were legally, nominally German. And there was a very short-lived time where there were supposed to be like hyphenated identities like German Turk, German Palestinian, but that shifted quickly with the anxiety about Islam as a religion that actually is in many ways also organized politically across the globe, but did not have the same the same effect on German soil. So what happened in Germany, and this is, I think, also a slight difference to France that Elie mentioned, is that Germany is actually a context where religion is acknowledged and public, it's appreciated. So German secularism works slightly differently. So there is a relationship with religious institutions. It's heavily regulated. So it is in France. And there is actually a strong appreciation of religion because it takes the role of providing care, of providing institutions. And this also has a longer history that I cannot go into. But basically what happened here is that this group that emerged as a religious group now did not have the collective right to be a religious group. So religious freedom in Germany, as it is quite generous. You have the right to religious freedom, and you can also not practice any religion. But collectively, it's organized in a way that it's called public corporation, a legal status that churches enjoy, and currently Islam doesn't. And the thing is that until now, actually, and for a long time, especially in the 60s and 70s, this was a transnational issue between Turkey and Germany, where Turkey could, you know, send imams and fund mosques. Similarly, Muslim communities who were not of Turkish descent, like the ones that I mentioned, like the Palestinian or other Arab ethnic groups, they were based on donations. They would build their own mosques or receive donation from outside. Now, this became a problem because as a religious group that is naturalized in Germany, German Muslims should have state support to build their own institutions. But what happened is that with the formal criteria of public corporation is that you had to show that you're rooted in Germany for 30 years. You had to show that you do your religious practice in German, and you had to show that you have a registry with a sizable membership. And this became a problem because actually most mosques in Germany were registered as an association and not as a public. They were not a public corporation. And as an association, you don't have these registries. But these demands to kind of come up with names and registries coincided with securitization laws. So the mosques actually, by starting to collect names, they were also collecting, kind of doing a different kind of work, a kind of a surveillance work for the state in certain ways. And the state itself said, look, we want to embrace German, we want to embrace German Islam. We want a German Islam, the Minister of Interior said in 2006. This was also another shift from that liberal democratic years, you can say, to a more conservative, where the German Ministry of Interior said, we want a German Islam, we want a homegrown Islam. but we have issues with the way Islam is lived publicly. And we also think that it has to be a German Islam that is tolerant. So this is a really interesting claim, because what counts as tolerance is a whole nother debate. And I can say more about this in the Q&A, but basically the German state started to invite German, like Muslims, or address a large number of people as Muslims who were not homogeneous, very heterogeneous actually, and tried to organize them under a certain homogenizing and securitizing logic. And that logic actually also included a certain definition of extremism, which was a different way of saying terrorism. And this also has a longer history in the German context, whereby there are other forms of extremism, like left-wing extremism defined by the state, which is communism, and neo-Nazism, which is right-wing extremism. But with the case of Islamic extremism, and with the way basically these former migrants were now interpolated and addressed as Muslims, a different kind of extremism was defined, one that is rooted in religion, which in the case of left-wing or right-wing extremism is not the case. And the problem for the German state was that Islam is transnationally organized. There's evidence for that. Islam blurs the boundaries of the secular state. So, one big issue is like, should public clerks be allowed to wear headscarves or other religious, what is considered a symbol in that context? Should other religious symbols be seen in public institutions? Also, given that traditional Islam was considered not secular enough to kind of accept the boundaries of public and private, can it be trusted, or will there be always more demand by Muslim groups? And also, certain understandings of practices or issues that came up that could be very well explained as an affect crime or as a form of crime was culturalized and was considered a traditional Islamic crime or a traditional Islamic problem that is normal in the Islamic context, but here it becomes a crime. And another thing that came up was anti-Semitism, that, being anti-Semitic is part of like why traditional Islam has these intolerant forms of public conduct. So my work in general basically picked up here, and what I looked at with different groups in Berlin and civil society organizations were like, how did they counter, how did they deal with these heavy load of accusations and suspicion coming from the state? And the interesting thing was that, and I think this is something that Elie also mentioned, is that first of all, there's no language, there's no conceptual understanding for race as something that is not just a problem of skin color, but a problem of created differentiation in which you basically fix and ascribe certain characteristics and attitudes to a group, and in which a certain group also emerges through legal and political inequalities, right? So that language was not there. The language that was really there was the language of tolerance. And what basically the civic educators tried to tell me or tried to do in their programs was oftentimes a way of learning to be tolerant, not to express intolerant speech, not to express intolerant views. And whenever something was expressed that was considered intolerant, and I can say more about this during the Q&A, there were ways of working against that. And when I tried to sometimes counteract and ask or question, okay, why was this considered intolerant? For example, when certain questions came about, like a girl basically was saying that, she doesn't understand why she can never become a teacher in these civil society education programs. She said she's veiled, she's religious, she knows that, but she really loves teaching and she would like to be a teacher, and she knows she will never be one, but she also knows that Angela Merkel is the head of the Christian Democratic Union. So how does that compare, for example? And that was oftentimes by the educators. I mean, they had an explanation for why that was, but it was kind of also shut down as a form of like, you know, Christianity and Europe were oftentimes conflated as already secular and universal, whereas Islam and Islamic practices were considered just too particular for the public. And that the problem was really that it's not secularized enough. So this to kind of give a broader framing intro into this. So in that sense, Muslims are this very interesting racial religious category. Actually, they're not a minority in the legal sense. They're not a minority with group differentiated rights, with collective rights, but at the same time, they're a very racialized minority that can, in the category, attach a whole spectrum of people, and they're actually similarly victim of police and state violence, as Elie showed us in his examples. And in many ways, these forms of violence have been going on, I would say, since the early 90s, and oftentimes discussed as a problem of inner Muslim or inner clan clashes. There's a whole discourse on like why Muslims have these problems, because they operate within the traditional clan mentality, as opposed to with the NSU, the National Socialist Underground project that came to the fore, where we could see that for 10 years, the police investigated the Turkish families and the Kurdish families for clan criminality, when in fact, there was a whole Nazi right-wing structure coming from within the police and targeting Turkish and Kurdish shop owners. So the shock was big, but at the same time, it also shows you that what is missing here is a clear language, is a clear conceptual frame of like how race operates and organizes this group of people that is very heterogeneous in this like very one-dimensional way. And I can say more about my work. This is just a snapshot from like one of the tolerance sessions where we went to the Anne Frank Center to think about how Germany has become more tolerant since the Holocaust, which is the whole framing of my book, that actually what we're in is a pre-Holocaust logic of wanting to govern religious difference in a way that it resembles a Protestant German assimilated form. And we do this by way of actually mobilizing Holocaust memory in very interesting ways. Thank you.
Great. So let's add Magda's perspective to this wonderful array of stories. Please, Magda.
Hello, everyone. Fascinating presentations. Thank you so much for the invitation, Daniela and Elizabeth. It's such a great pleasure and honor to participate in this conversation with Sultan and Elie and with all of you. In my presentation, I will talk about racism, and more specifically about structural anti-Roma racism or structural racism against Romani people in Europe, hoping to discuss together with you some points of commonalities, which I've already seen in Edie's presentation and in Sultan's presentations, looking at various forms of oppression in Europe and possible ways also towards solidarity between us and between the oppressed people in Europe. I want to start the conversation by stating perhaps the obvious. I think that for a long time, many European leaders, opinion makers, academics, and people have denied and continue to deny the existence or the practice, the reality of racism on the continent. And Elie spoke about it quite a lot. And I think that conveniently they see racism only as an American problem, and at best perhaps as interpersonal racism, which occurs among individuals. So that's the compromise that they are willing to make. However, I think it is important to remind ourselves that before the Holocaust and throughout the 19th and the 20th century, European scientists crafted, augmented, and applied the concept of race and the superiority of white race in all our lives. And even before the birth of the theories of races, Europeans, leaders, and rulers had used race and cultural prejudice to justify colonization, oppressive policies, violence, killings and exploitation of Jewish people, Muslim people, Black people, and other marginalized communities and people of color in Europe. It is true, nevertheless, that after the Holocaust, Europe has engaged more drastically in dismantling, at least at the academic level, the concepts of biological race, race superiority, and race inferiority. However, some of the scholarship in Europe has also argued that the existence and the practice of racism were strictly connected to the existence of a theory of race. And I think that such theories, though, have the power to reduce the history of racism to scientific or biological racism, and thus to dismiss earlier, but also later forms of racism or racisms. Would, for instance, the 500 years of slavery or Roma in the territories of Romania, starting in the 1300s, be considered racism? Or wouldn't it be somehow inaccurate to claim that we live in a post-racial Europe just because the forms of racism that we experience today are not justified through racial science, but rather through cultural and behavioral racism? So what I'm saying is that this post-racial Europe narrative, I suggest that is one of the responses why the recent European scholarship has not really engaged much in race and racism studies as a present-day reality within the continent. And racism is considered a taboo topic at the political level too. I think that some of you may recall that recently, responding to the wave of protests following the lynching of George Floyd by the police in the United States, the Vice President of the European Commission stated that Europe was doing better on issues of race than the United States because Europe had better systems of social protection, of social inclusion, and also universal health care. But this illusion of a post-racial Europe has long been trumpeted on the continent. But in order to address structural racism, I think that one first needs to recognize that it exists. Nevertheless, I think that Black Lives Matter protests in the United States have recently sparked some European conversations on racism. And the European Commission even adopted a 5-year anti-racism plan of action recently. But of course, this plan is far from being a panacea for structural racism in Europe, but it is perhaps an opportunity or a start in a long process to recognize and dismantle structural racism. But I think that yet policymakers, politicians, and even much of the scholarship have awfully neglected the existence of anti-Roma racism on the continent. For instance, during some recent talks among the members of the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, the governments of Denmark, France, and Sweden refused to use the word racism in defining the experience, the racism experienced by Roma in Europe. The governments conveniently compromised on anti-Gypsyism / anti-Roma discrimination. Thus, yes, I would say that European governments do stay away from the responsibility to acknowledge and seriously address structural anti-Roma racism within the continent. For long, anti-Roma racism has been and continues to be accepted and acceptable in Europe. And is not even perceived as racism, but rather as some sort of incapacity or disinterest of Roma to integrate. And you see that in policy making too. But what do I mean by anti-Roma racism? I think that structural racism against Romani people transpires in all aspects of our European societies, from laws to policies, cultures and arts, and also societies. And it is deeply connected to a continuous history of state-sponsored injustices. And I think that both Sultan and Elie alluded to the history. Anti-Roma racism, I think that similar to other forms of racism and oppression, manifests itself at the institutional, ideological, cultural, individual levels. Institutional racism against Roma has often taken very overt forms, from police violence, as in the cases that Sultan also described, to segregation in education or forced sterilization of Romani women in various European countries. And often laws, policies, and measures themselves have been racist or reproduce racist ideologies and historical and existing injustices. Among other reasons, because first of all, policymakers, experts, and academics writing about social and economic issues of Roma are racist or biased. And second of all, because there is a lack of representation of Roma, and consequently a lack of a Roma voice in culture, science, in the media, scholarships, politics, intergovernmental organizations, local and national governments, and in all aspects of policies, politics, and life. And we all know that social, cultural, and political and economic power has always stayed with the dominant majorities in Europe. Furthermore, speaking about cultures and ideologies, the norms, beliefs, and values of dominant populations in Europe have been for a long time considered to be the standard, the norm. And in this context, often Roma and other racialized groups are seen and portrayed as vulnerable, as inferior, criminals, or simply ignored oftentimes. Perhaps the lack of children's books with Romani characters is the most simple example that I can think of when discussing, cultural racism. But we also talk about the continuous denial of the history of state-sponsored injustices, such as the Roma experience during the Holocaust in Europe, the big gypsy roundup in Spain, or the Roma slavery in Romania for 500 years. And also this disinterest to ensure the moral right to reparations through acknowledgement, apologies, memorialization, truth-telling, and also financial compensations. And finally, interpersonal racism against Roma happens not only through intentional racist discourse or discriminatory actions, but also through reproducing, intentionally or not, ideas rooted in the ideology of inferiority or the ideology of criminality of Romani people. It manifests itself also through covert and overt forms, or what some people would call even, implicit or explicit biases. The overt forms as hate crimes and racist discourse are at least prohibited by law. But covert forms such as stigmatization and everyday discrimination or everyday racism are not. These are perhaps less obvious manifestations translated through the lack of respect or poorer services in public places, or those times when Romani people are treated with indifference, over-scrutinized, misunderstood, feared, underestimated, overlooked, or shunned. Instances when I think Roma are ignored, stamped and treated as inferior, lazy, and criminal. And when their humanity is constantly questioned and denied. Also, in discussing anti-Roma racism, the historical context is extremely important. It's relevant to acknowledge and act upon the fact that after their arrival in Europe about 1,000 years ago, the Roma blackness positioned them straight away as an inferior people. Looking back at the history, we have to remind ourselves and again act upon the fact that Romani people have not been treated with dignity and respect throughout their history on the territories of Europe. And when we talk about anti-Roma racism, we have to keep in mind not only actual covert and overt manifestations, but also the absence of policies, measures, laws, taking into considerations Roma's needs, and the absence of Roma in spaces of power, arts and cultures, and so on. But let me give you an example of a more particular problem faced by Romani people, namely segregation in education. Throughout the history of public education, laws and policy makers, but also academics, have deployed several ideas to justify anti-Roma racism. One of these ideas was that as part of our culture, we, Roma, do not value education. Yet it has been the institutions who rejected Roma from schools through laws and practices, and also portray Roma as inferior and uneducated to justify oppression and to justify school segregation. For instance, in 1927, state institutions in Czechoslovakia adopted eugenic laws and policies and created special schools for Roma children, portraying them as inferior and also undesirable. Although not legal anymore, this practice, based on an abusive and racist misdiagnosis of mental disability, continues to this day, both in the Czech Republic and Slovakia. And more broadly, according to an EU study, one Roma child out of every 10 has attended a special school or class that was mainly for Roma, even if it was for a short period. But at the national level, there have been some wins that give us a little bit of hope and perhaps can help us imagine better laws, strategies, and legal arguments. For instance, in 2018, a German government awarded compensations to a 21-year-old Romani man who was wrongly placed in a special school in Germany for 11 years. And according to the media, and I quote, judges based their ruling on the assumption that if he had been allowed to attend a mainstream school, he would have completed all the basic education requirement by the age of 16. Thus, by assigning him to special school, he was denied that opportunity, which has had consequences detrimental to his professional prospects. There are also a few cases where individual redress was ensured by the European Court of Human Rights. For instance, a few dozen Roma children have benefited financially from remedies received after the European Court's judgment found they had been unjustly placed in special schools. But of course, 4,000 euros, the amount received by each of the 17 applicants in a landmark case called DH versus the Czech Republic, does not undo the lifelong social, economic, and emotional impact of segregation in an educational system with an inferior curriculum. Moreover, although the European Court of Human Rights has acknowledged that segregation in special school affects more than half of the Romani children in some regions and towns, its judgments cannot generate justice and reparations for the large pool of affected Roma children. Thus, and I'm going to conclude here, I argue that the current individual human rights framework is helpful, but is not enough to address collective injustices, structural inequalities, and present-day racism. To address structural racism, along with reforming institutions and laws, we need to think about other legal tools that have at their core the concepts of justice and reparations. I believe that collective and systemic justices require collective remedies and wide-ranging remedies. Thank you.
Thank you so much to the three of you. I'm delighted that I brought the three of you together to have this kind of array of experiences, each of them very particular, and yet each of them very relatable to the others here. There are stories that we have become familiar with, stories of historical racism in Europe, and there are stories that need to be told afresh and repeatedly. And it sounds like there is energy at this point to tell these stories stories and, if necessary, string them along. There seems to be a common plea here. Let's call racism for what it is, because unless we do that, and until we do that, we are not going to grapple with it. And the problem is not the word itself. The problem is pretending that it doesn't exist. Another theme that is common in between the three presentations is the invocation of law, right? Sometimes law is the tool with which we fight things. Some other times law is the source of the structures that allow these things to happen. I am familiar with some episodes in European Union law that have tried to tackle these things, beginning with, pressure on Romania before, at the time of the Great Accession, to shape up in terms of protection of Roma minorities in order for them to even become members of the European Union. Other leverage points, the Turks in Germany, a long time ago, the European Court of Justice deployed the Ankara Treaty of Association between Europe and Turkey in order to activate the provisions of non-discrimination in favor of Turkish workers in Germany, something that Germany itself had not done, but that the European Court of Justice prompted as a movement in Germany. So we must at the same time be aware of the tools of justice that law at the state level, at the European level gives us, but also aware of the structures that are realized through the law itself. Vis-a-vis African immigration, there was certainly, there is a book I love, it's called Eurafrica, which talks about the fact that in a way, the European integration process somehow facilitated the continuation of certain relations with the African continent that on the surface had been completely discontinued by the member states. So there's a lot of work to investigate. It's important, again, to see the commonalities, because until these groups remain separated, I think we cannot make the conceptual shifts that we need. And there is another thing in common. So the fixation, if you want, the centrality of individual rights in anything European, which seems to be something that the three of you have been struggling with in terms of finding it something that slows down the possibility of effective remedies. The last presenter, Magda, talked about reparations, and we cannot think of reparations as something that is done one person at a time. So the structure of individual rights simply does not lead itself to the possibility of reconceiving remedies for groups. There are many reasons why Europe resists the idea of groups and some of group rights. And some of these ideas are evolving. Some stick. For instance, in the case of the structure of the European Union, the very sense of European Union law is based on individuals. From Van Ghent, from the idea that we had to dismantle the state as a collectivity of people and reach directly from Brussels or from Luxembourg to individual people, is something that has reinforced the state-based idea that we look at people one at a time, which in turn stands in the way of understanding structural dynamics. So what I would like to do now is explore any of these many themes. And there's only so much that we can do. But whenever we do this, let's think about two things. One is the commonality between the three stories of the speakers. And the other one is the centrality of law, in particular European law and its potential in unlocking certain entrenched and sad mechanisms in our reality. So I invite, first of all, the speakers, the three speakers, to speak to one another, to react to one another, starting with Eddie. And meanwhile, I'll take questions from the audience.
Thanks, Daniela, and thank you, Sultan and Magda. Those were really powerful and yeah, really thought-provoking and also really quite heavy perspectives, because of the ways that all of these communities have certain issues that are kind of pulling away the possibility for having a language and having traction with language in institutions that will help, like Daniela was saying, help to leverage the legal remedies that might be most appropriate, most helpful. And whenever I think about the possibility of either national law or European law weighing in, I always get nervous because of some of the things that you've both pointed out. so Sultan, when you were pointing out the change in citizenship law in Germany, providing the space for there to be some discussion about how everything's opening up, but it's still conditional, like citizenship is still conditional upon these various things that keep a certain logic of what it means to be German intact, and therefore kind of maintains those boundaries to having maybe a more frank and open discussion about difference and othering, and the types of restrictions that are put on citizenship that then reverberate into the rest of thinking about belonging and protection. And then Magda, when you were talking about the cases like the desegregation cases and the big structural problem that these cases don't actually address, and the remedies in terms of the people who are facing these problems always has always struck me as one of the disconnects between doing strategic litigation at the level of, discrimination law at the European Court of Human Rights, or human rights law, or EU law for that matter as well, and what people are facing on the ground, the material conditions that people find themselves in or are put in. So I guess one question, I guess Danielle has already asked it in a way, but one question is if there could be one, if there are demands that we could make of the European Union in its action plan. And I think the action plan, like you've mentioned, Magda, is not a panacea, and there's no way to even consider this as being more than the beginning of a discussion. But how might we frame our demands to be able to address an opening up of the language and the types of conversations that states need to have to begin to see some of these structural problems? And I guess I asked that from the perspective of knowing that even with the race directive in 2000 that opened up the, it was the beginning of having states draft these legislation that was going to at least provide protection on the basis of discrimination in the different member states. It didn't shift the terrain on what structural racism looks like and how we deal with how this, the carving a language out in these different countries around seeing structural problems. So what might be a demand that we could formulate for this action plan to create that space? So that's a question I'm thinking of.
So, Sultan, would you like to reply to the other two? And this is a really good question, Eddie. Let's get back to this one.
Yeah, a lot to think with here. And also, Daniela, the questions that you gave out, the commonality versus not commonality on the one hand between the topics, between the stories we've told you, the cases we've given out, and the European laws architecture centered on the individual, right? And you were saying in order to kind of reach that individual directly from Brussels. It's interesting, actually, because there are other, as Eddie just mentioned, there are other motions and recommendations that are given out to the state in order to protect individuals who are discriminated against, in order to take this and reform policies, reform legislation. But the interesting thing is that the rights, the collective rights, are not given. So we know that Germany did accept a certain concept of discrimination, and you cannot discriminate against gender and religion and what have you, right? But at the same time, collectively, like the normative shift did not happen. And I think what I heard in Magda's really powerful talk was that norms, beliefs, and values have been shaped in Europe only through the majority. And this is interesting for me to hear from Magda, because this is actually something that I'm thinking with all the time. How come, for example, that the history of the Holocaust is so exceptionalized in the way it can tell us about race and racism in Europe, as opposed to generalized. Yes, it's a genocide, which is singular, but the many mechanisms that went into this genocide, the many structures that were historically sedimented and targeted a range of people who were considered not European. How come that this part gets always overwritten, especially in public commemoration? And I'm not saying this lightly. I have a postdoc in the Elie Wiesel Center for Jewish Studies, where I think about these things with colleagues. And Magda, you mentioned the IRA alliance, where ministers and government officials come together. You know, the IRA, actually, interestingly enough, one of its main head directors sits in the Elie Wiesel Center, Steve Katz, who is a dear colleague of mine. And it is interesting to me that in many ways, what's happening there, all the emotional and moral outpouring that comes together, rightfully so, again, becomes a way to carve out a space for a singular exceptional crime and then give other names and other categories to other crimes, which to me, if we want to think about the space in order to reframe the discussion, this would be maybe not the starting point, but one of the nodal points to go into, like what is happening here in the way we relate and we exceptionalize this history, as opposed to how can we actually make this history help us articulate race and racism? Because when you look at it, and Holocaust and genocide scholars do that all the time, when you look at this conceptually, you do see that there's so much going on that should be far more generative for our discussion. So how do we do that in terms of, like, you know, how are we enabled to do that? One thing is obviously scholarship, but like another thing is to overcome certain barriers, right? And the barriers, and I think that's what I really heard in both Eddie's talk and also in Magda's talk, is like, you know, the activism, the Afro-German activism to bring out just a name on that street that acknowledges Afro-German existence and that also lays bare and excavates German complicity in colonial crimes. That one activism, how much work that took, right? And how little that is when you look at it, how little, not because the people who did that did too little, it's because it doesn't generate more. And I think Magda said this idea of like undesirable, the inferior, that the you know, you can put them in a different school. Like this, I don't know if you want to say dehumanized, but this whole perception of people who are in Europe, but who are never part of Europe. I mean, this, to lay this bare, to give space to that, I don't know. And you know, part of the problem in the EU in general, I would say, I know this very well from Germany, is that there is no philanthropic structure. There is no Mellon Foundation that will give you other funds other than the German government gives you, or, you know, Marie Curie gives you, or what have you, some EU fund gives you. I mean, the structures are very tight. It's like really government and scholarship has a very close relationship. So how would we open up these spaces? I'm not sure how, but I think that is the work that needs to be done.
Magda, your response to the panel.
Yes. So Sultan, I think that the moment when I was talking about norms and standards and how we are seen through the lens of white norms and standards, really the example that you gave about, you know, being Angela Merkel and the, you know, part of the Christian Democrat Party as opposed to being part of a party that would represent Muslim party, or so it's such a big controversy, such a big dichotomy there, seen as normal in the case of Christian Democrats, but not as normal in the case of Muslims. So I think that was so powerful for me to listen and to basically show it as an example. But I think that in terms of Eddie's question, perhaps of what can be done, I would also perhaps add the idea of who can do what. And I do see that the role of scholars as very much important, Because if in the, I don't know, 18th and 19th centuries, scholars were so much involved in, assigning a race to us and telling us that we are inferior, I think that we need a little bit of courage now to actually be more than just scholars, and to be scholar activists or activist scholars, and have the power to, to actually be in these spaces of power like the European Commission, and actually, help them understand what race is. Because, the plan that the European Commission put in place, mentions structural racism here and there, but the idea of racism in Europe is very much based on the concept of individual or interpersonal racism. So for them, it's always about discrimination, from one person to another, but it's very, very rarely about how, the laws, the structures, the culture, everything is very much white in Europe. So I think that we do have a role to play, and how we get to be in those spaces is complicated and it's challenging, because it's not convenient for politicians to have people like you, people like us at the table. But I think that we do have a role, and in order to make that action plan much more reliable and to make it actionable, I think that we need to take a stand and to be part of the conversation.
So I wanted to mention something. You're all invited to other events, of course, here at the center, and one is happening actually next week, and it's a presentation by Jonathan Zatlin of a co-edited volume on the repossession of the dispossession of Jews in the early part of the 20th century in Germany. And if you start reading the introduction, it's all about the importance of telling the story in detail, from how there were fantasies of Jewish wealth that actually did not correspond to reality, and again about all the structural means in which somehow this monster could be constructed so that horrible things could happen and wealth could be taken away in a way that seemed legitimate on the surface. These are powerful stories, and I think what you guys are doing here is telling the stories. And I think the more detail, the more granularity of the way in which what seemed normal was actually not normal at all, or should not have been normal at all, is a fantastic contribution that academics can bring to the world of activism, because there are hidden stories and the granularity of the stories is important. The other thing that I think is important to recognize here is that there's no question at this point that Europe owns its racism when it comes to the Holocaust. There's no question that that is owned fully by Europe. It's a fact. It's accepted as a fact. So the point is, as Sultan I think is doing, is to mobilize the stories that we already have of real, pervasive, structural racism in European history, not so long ago, and see them again through the tool of, for instance, the reception of migrants from Africa and the Middle East in Europe, right? Because there is the discourse of fortress Europe that we have come to normalize, but it does lead to treatment of groups, defined as groups, the immigrants, the citizens of overseas, as the French government likes to call the people who are not really French, right? So there are these groups, and bring them to the surface. When I started in the wake of the equality directives back in 2003, I became preoccupied with this line of research because what struck me at the time was really the lack of understanding of groups in Europe. Not because we didn't. What I did back then when I studied this was to look for groups that in fact are recognized. Danish minorities. So, you find groups that it looks like the individual is the only focus of European law and the law of the nations of Europe, but it's not true. You find direct and indirect ways of addressing groups. When the troubles in Northern Ireland would not have been overcome without some conscious attempt to create quotas for certain religious minorities within the Irish police. And this was a conscious effort that targeted specific groups because of problems that were structural. They were not about individual discrimination. So reforming the police in a way that guaranteed inclusiveness in the police force was essential to the solution of the Irish troubles, right? So those were measures which, contrary to the general belief, were based on the recognition that there are structural group relations in Europe. So it is absolutely not true, as a matter of fact, that European law is incapable of conceiving the category of groups. And so I would welcome anybody who's doing research here to push towards the identification of what group understandings have already been legalized in the fabric of European and national law. So to me, the how is the recognition that Europe is not juridically incapable of embracing the concept of groups. Reparation is another legal move that to me is fantastic and really, really, really promising. So I'm very interested in what we will learn from the presentation of the book next week on dispossession of German Jewry, precisely because of the lesson it teaches as the possibility of telling a powerful story and treating it the way it needs to be treated, with reparations that take into account the fact that gigantic dispossession had happened. So I think there's work to do. And I thank you guys for all the work you are doing and look forward to more of that. We have great audience here, and I was wondering if anybody wanted to chip in now through the chat function or the Q&A function. It would be great to hear. These are controversial topics. Just to raise a point of controversy, the New York Times, I think it was a week ago or more than 2 weeks ago, talked about the story of the French teacher who was assassinated because of an attempt to discuss freedom of expression in France. And those are the stories that, of course, make the headlines and make people queasy about, focusing on minorities and maybe reinforce the idea that minorities can be dangerous, etc. So in the United States, how do we tell those stories? What kind of perspective can we bring to stories like that one, which of course need to be addressed?
Daniela, if I may clarify something also from my side.
Please, Sultan.
Because you brought it up, I do agree with you that, Europe, part of the work that IRA does successfully is to have Europe acknowledge and not forget its obligation not to forget anti-Semitism and the Holocaust. So this is the work that Europe is doing on an official level. That is true. At the same time, we did have in the past incidents where it was unclear if this was actually followed up. So the circumcision debate in Germany in 2012, that was in the beginning debated only with regards to Muslim in certain anti-Semitic ways, actually, until it became also an issue for the Jewish community that said, look, this is a traditional practice for us. It's important for our religious identity as a community. And this is entangled with the promise to never again and having Jewish life in Germany again. So that's when the German government actually became a bit more careful. And also like the public discourse became a bit more careful in how they discussed this issue. So I do agree with you on what you said about, this is a promise, this is acknowledged. But at the same time, there's a certain social level in which this gets forgotten. And this also applies to collective rights. As you mentioned, there is a Danish minority in Germany with certain rights. There is a Sorbian minority in Germany with certain rights, language rights, and certain representation. If another group wanted to have the same rights, especially with regards to Muslims at the moment, it becomes an issue of disintegration. It becomes a security issue. So it's also a matter of who is considered part of the European family in a way.
And just maybe to add two little pieces to that, with the national minority rights are, as you mentioned, Sultan, connected to language rights and connected to rights that have to do with a certain conception of permanency and longstanding history that I think needs a lot of unpacking, especially when we think about the development of the concept of a national minority in international law is related to I think developed in a time and with certain conceptions of movement or non-movement in European spaces that I think it just doesn't work today in terms of thinking about protection and the needs of communities, which is why only a few groups are covered officially in Germany, for example, as national minorities. but I think that kind of investigation is really productive. As Daniela said, what kind of group rights are available, and how does that change or alter our idea of what law is capable of? I guess, but the other thing is, I think that there is, not to sound cynical, but there is a way in which these identifications are also serviceable by the state in terms of lending some value to the way that the state is presenting the nation and the way and the benefits. So I think there needs to be scholarship on the effects that it has to present as a legitimate kind of human rights defender of certain groups, which also makes it clear that there needs to be some acceptance of the past. There needs to be some reckoning that's public. But then how does that diffuse or change the way in which a state might understand linking these stories as maybe less serviceable in terms of the legitimacy concerns that a state might have? And how do we shift the moral and ethical frame around being protected by the state, which is already problematic, but in terms of law and law as a tool, how do we shift that to, and also deal with and recognize the serviceability of protecting certain groups over others?
And perhaps, Sultan, on your last point, I would also add that we have to start thinking more strategically about how we make it clearer that we deal with so many double standards in Europe. And I think that these parallel stories, which are similar, but then the response is different, may help us Europeans to actually understand that we apply double standards, to help us understand that we are racist in so many ways. And I think that part of the conversation is really how to create an understanding in Europe that racism is not prejudice. Racism is not cultural prejudice, is not race prejudice, but is in many ways, as Francisco Bettencourt would call it, a political project. So it's very much led by institutions, by cultures, by establishments, and then all these race prejudice and cultural prejudice are used to justify racism. And therefore, whatever we would think about the banality of evil in Arendt's words, then it feels like normal in many ways for white Europeans to think that it is okay to treat white Germans in a way, and then Black Germans in a totally different way, or Muslim Germans in a totally different way, because morally you can justify that behavior through putting some attributes, negative attributes, on the minority. So I think we need to to unpack that a little bit more clear, and to make it clear that we do operate with so many double standards.
One thing that I wanted to bring up here is the possibility of coalitions, sort of strategic coalitions, really, or operational coalitions, not necessarily strategic. So I'm going to bring up something that it may sound silly, but I think stories are important. The movie A Chambra by Jonas Carpignano is a movie that portrays the impossibility of friendship between African immigrants and Roma minorities in southern Italy, which is where I come from. It is an amazing movie. I really recommend it. However, it's very troubling, right? Because it does portray the difficulty of crossing the barrier. Most of all, in the logic of that movie, which is very neo-realist in approach, is because these are communities that are sharing very scarce resources, competing for very scarce resources, and so sharing is not what you do when you barely have what's enough. How do we go about that? How do we create solidarity? Europe prides itself to have free health insurance, to have education that is in principle open to everybody. And therefore, the idea is that's the place where we find, in this point in American history and politics, I want to emphasize the importance of these things, which are essential. But are they enough to overcome the difficulties that then make resources so limited. And when resources are so limited, then it becomes extremely difficult to even begin to think of sharing them. How is it possible? I mean, I'm talking about the political economy aspect of this now. How can we raise the level of poverty so that the groups could actually begin to dream of solidarity and sharing, because there is something to share as opposed to nothing?
I would like to say a few words, particularly because I watched the movie at your advice, Daniela, and I'm very grateful for that recommendation. I think that in many ways it was fabulous to see, actual Roma and actual people in the whole story, and their stories being told. But at the same time, while watching the movie, I kept thinking, is there another story to tell about Roma and African people in Europe as well? Is it all about criminality? Like, the topic is, it's so much about, stealing and about being at the limit of legality. And I think that I was trying to think about a Roma related movie that was directed by a non-Roma director, and I could not come up with a movie that didn't have criminality as the main topic. So I think that remains problematic across Europe. Right. But I think that in terms of, of solidarity, at least in this small space at Harvard, we've tried to create some spaces of solidarity between Dalit scholars. Suraj Yanda is one of the most well-known in our space, and the most loved one for sure, and then Cornel West, and some leaders of the Black Lives Movement in Boston. And it is not easy, right? So we have a small place here at Harvard, and we are trying to create solidarity, but we are trying to learn one about another and about the struggles of our people, because in many ways oppression finds so many commonalities, but at the same time we do have to recognize and to be very sensitive about the specificity of each struggle. So we are trying to build solidarity as much as we can, and we have Professor West talking about Roma and Dalits in so many spaces, and it's it's a joy to see him acknowledging our struggle and our people. But at the same time, when it comes to creating solidarity in a space where racial capitalism it's happening and it's a reality, and to share resources in a space in which people of color of Europe do not really have the same access to resources as the others, where people like Romanian Roma had been exploited for 500 years during the slavery, and then there is a huge wealth gap that we don't even measure in Europe. So in these conditions, it's really hard to create that space of solidarity. And at the same time, we are in the space in which we are all victims of whiteness, because we go to the same schools with the others. We learn that to be white is the norm, to be white is the standard, to be white is to be superior. I have children around me in my family and all that. They come at home and they say, I don't want to be a gypsy anymore. They learned about the value of whiteness early on in childhood. So in this space, it's very complicated to create that level of solidarity. But I think that we can start with activists, and some level of solidarity has already been started in Europe. And we can start with scholars. We can start with people who have a level of privilege that can help them, understand and be able to connect these dots. But I think it's complicated in a space where so many people of color and so many people are victims of racism and racial capitalism and all that in Europe, to actually, ask them to be in a place of solidarity.
Yeah, I mean, I have similar experiences in academic circles where we have, working with a group of scholars, Roma scholars with scholars from different parts of the world, and then coming up against the demands of the institutions that we're at, that either might not value the work that we're trying to do at the same level as they would value a different type of research. So for example, the textbook that we want to write on race in Europe, that really tries to bring these voices together and with scholarship that's coming from communities that we're writing about is not worth a lot in legal academia. Writing a textbook isn't the same as writing a monograph or an article, but those resources of knowing these legal cases is really important for those who really want to get into the legal provisions and critique them, or to use them. So that's kind of one roadblock. I have noticed, though, in organizing circles, and I'm at the margins of organizing because I'm kind of in the in certain formations as a legal expert, but the organizers of bereaved family members who have lost loved ones in police violence have brought together, bereaved family members from different communities, from Turkish and Kurdish and Black communities and Roma communities from across different countries. And to see the organizing work that they're doing together, it's on one hand, it's in the same context. And I also wonder, it's like, are we ever going to see this working and togetherness outside of the context of responding to violence that's just constant? But on the other hand, there are a lot of lasting relationships that have come out of that, and sharing those stories, like Daniela was saying and Magda was saying about these stories, has been really formative. And I feel like there's a conversation that maybe wouldn't have happened 15 years ago amongst those organizing across Europe against police brutality, for example. So, I mean, it's possible, and there are ways that it's happening now. And I guess supporting those types of efforts somehow, whether financially or with some sort of in-kind support, I think would be useful.
Talking about conversations that wouldn't happen otherwise. I mean, a center, an academic center of any kind, I think serves its function when it brings together people that for some reason, I have always thought of, when I contacted each of you, you all knew of each other, and we were looking forward to working together, but somehow it hadn't happened yet, right? So it has happened. I'm delighted that I brought you together. This was really wonderful for me to listen to. And as a white person growing up in Europe, I have to do my big share of learning. There's no question about that. I'm delighted to have the opportunity to do this, and I thank you all for this. The conversation will be available. We will continue to refer to this conversation next week when we talk about dispossession with Jonathan Zatlin and others. And again, any time in which the plurality of stories seems to converge to the need to change the way we do things in Europe and each of the nation states, because I think that's the plea that I've heard from each of you. So we remain here, one Zoom call away from each other. And I really thank you and look forward to staying in touch, look forward to comments on the website where we're going to post this lecture. I thank Elizabeth immensely, always, for all that she does to keep this center going. Thank you all, and thank you to our attendees. Thank you for being with us. Look forward to further comments. Take care, guys.
Thank you,
Bye-bye.
Daniela. Thank you.
Thank you. This was wonderful. Let's stay in touch.